So, my name's James, and I'm going to talk to you about what I call the way of the web. So, let's start with a picture. Can anyone tell me what this is? Close. So, Mars was here from the front. This is actually a picture of the surface of Venus, and this was taken back in 1982 by a probe called Venera 13. Now, the amazing thing about this probe is, as it was coming down to the surface, it had to contend with 360 km/h winds, clouds made of sulfuric acid. On the surface, the temperature was 457 degrees, which is hot enough to melt lead, apparently. And the atmospheric pressure is 89 times what it is here on Earth. So that's kind of like as if you were diving in the ocean at about 900 meters depth. So this thing was being crushed, it was being melted, it was being corroded, and yet it still managed to land, survive for about 2 hours, take some photos, even take some sound recordings and send them back to Earth, which is pretty amazing, right? So why am I telling you about space probes? Well, I think in some ways the web is a similarly challenging environment, right? Because there's a lot of stuff that we don't control. So if you imagine, so just make sure that's working. If you imagine your little website or web app kind of drifting down from the cloud to the user, it's got to contend with unpredictable network conditions. There might be congestion. There might be, just slow and laggy networks. There might be filters, right? There could be ISP filters, government filters, corporate filters, which will block some of the resources. And even when it lands in the user's viewport, there's no guarantees over the shape or even the size of that viewport, the capabilities of the device, the settings the user might have, right? They might be on high contrast mode or dark mode or reader mode. So there's a lot of stuff that we tend to think we can control, but actually we can't, right? There's so many unpredictable variations that our user interfaces have to survive to get to the user. And yet we as in teams, kid ourselves that we have control over these things. But, like I say, we don't. And what happens when we take, something that we thought we had gets taken away from us? Well, we grieve, right? And psychologists will tell you that there are stages of grief that you go through. So as we grieve our loss of control, we go through the first phase, which is denial, right? We bury our heads in the sand. We try and pretend like it's not that bad. There's things we can control. So this is an example of denial, right? Every UI design tool out there, when you create a new file, the first thing it's going to ask you is, what size do you want your canvas to be? And it rather helpfully has presets for iPhones and iPads and Macs, because of course everyone in the world is using those, right? And we talk about pixel perfection and the fold and things that originate in print design but don't really exist on the web, but we kind of pretend like they do, right? It's denial. The next stage of grief is anger. We shake our fist at those Luddites who are still stuck on old operating systems and underpowered devices and crappy networks. Why can't they just upgrade? Why do we have to deal with all of that? The next phase after that is bargaining. We try and rationalize away these problems. We might reach for stats and sort of try and say, well, if only 3-point-something% is using Samsung Internet, maybe we don't need to care about that one. But we can't force our users to use a particular browser or a particular device, so we have to deal with this somehow. And then the next phase is depression, right? We get overwhelmed. There's all these things, all these unpredictable variables that we need to account for and try and deal with. So we build frameworks and we build tools and we try and abstract away these differences. And then that becomes too much. And we get, imposter syndrome and JavaScript fatigue. And we just get overwhelmed by all this stuff. And ultimately it depresses us, right? But if we manage to work our way through all of those stages, we reach the fifth and final stage of dealing with loss, which is acceptance. And finally, we can accept the web for what it is, right? Yes, we don't control these things that we thought we did. In fact, that control arguably was never there. It was always an illusion. But actually, not being able to control every minute detail of what the user sees at the end of the day, or how our user interface behaves, is actually a strength. And we once we accept that, we get this Zen-like calm. And it's, well, let me elaborate, right? So people often talk about the browsers and device landscape being fragmented. Oh, there's so many different versions of Android or screen sizes or whatever it is. But that's just diversity, right? Like any good ecosystem in nature thrives when it's diverse. It would be a bad thing if everything was on the same, if people couldn't choose what devices they wanted to use. And the amazing thing about the web is that because of its flexibility and its malleability, the things that we build, as long as we build them right, won't just work on devices we have today, but they'll work on the stuff that comes along tomorrow. So when someone decides to make a folding screen or an innie and an outie one and a round one and add notches and, I don't know, make transparent screens or whatever comes next, it's not the end of the world, right? Our stuff just somehow adapts and browsers make it work as best they can, and people can carry on using our products. And this isn't actually a new thing. This has been in the web since it began. So this is the very first website, or the very first public one apparently, from CERN, running in the current version of Firefox. So this website was published in 1991 in August. I took that screenshot in February this year, so that's 27 and a half years or thereabouts, right? There's no way that when they built that website, they could anticipate what kind of devices or what browsers people might be using that much later on. And yet it works, right? More amazingly is it goes the other way around. So this is, well, technically a recreation, but this is the very first web browser that Tim Berners-Lee did on his next workstation. It's called World Wide Web. And I'm running websites from today in it. So I've got my Twitter feed, I've got the Verge homepage, and that's the homepage of the company I work for. Now, of course, they don't look exactly as they do in modern browsers, and all the bells and whistles don't work, but the guts of it is there, right? I can still read the text, I can still click links, I can read articles. So stuff we build today can still be working decades from now. And I don't think there's many other mediums that let you do that. I mean, do you really think the native apps that we publish in the app stores today will just work out of the box like that 30 years from now? I doubt it. So following on from this, I guess, this is part of this kind of denial stuff, right? We like to partition things, and people used to talk about the mobile web and the desktop web as if they're completely separate things, or websites and web apps, right? Because, I don't know, just because it's got a few buttons, it's suddenly a completely different thing. But I would argue there is just one web, right? If we publish something at a URL and it's public, anyone, anywhere, anytime, on any device can access it. And there's nothing we can do about that. So we can either deal with it, or we can bury our heads in the sand and pretend like otherwise. And yet there are these kind of myths that persist, right? So the classic one about people on their smartphones, they're always busy, right? They're always walking down the road and not really paying attention and stuff. Sure, that's one of the ways people might use a mobile device, but actually there's plenty of studies that show that that's not always the case. In fact, a lot of smartphone usage is at home, or people are stationary, or even on the toilet. Right, so they're sitting comfortably, they have both fingers available, they're focused. So yes, all these things, you can't assume that someone's going to be busy. The company I work for, we do a lot of work for big enterprises, and you often hear this kind of, or variations of this, like, oh, this thing is only for our intranet, and all our staff are on this corporate IT machine with Windows X and browser that, and therefore we don't need to worry about smartphones and tablets. It doesn't need to be responsive, it doesn't need to be device agnostic. But it's rubbish, because more and more companies have bring your own device policies, right? Staff can bring in their own device, and you're back to any staff can use any device to access all these internal applications as well. So the last one is the classic, oh, no one's ever going to do that on a smartphone, and therefore we don't have to support that thing on a smartphone. But you're assuming that people have access to other devices. They might not. So the stat is from the States actually, apparently 20% of people don't use broadband at home. So their only window to the internet is things like smartphones and tablets. So you might be locking out users if you limit yourself to certain devices. So the bottom line is everything needs to work on every device. It's just the way it is. Can't pretend otherwise. And besides, where do you draw the boundary today between a mobile or a tablet or a desktop, right? I mean, I can plug my phone into a dock with a monitor and a keyboard and a mouse and get a desktop environment. It's still running on my phone, but I'm not using a touchscreen anymore. If I'm on an iPad, I've got split screen mode, so I can't assume because I'm on an iPad, I've got the full resolution at my disposal. I could have some fraction of that. You can get keyboards and mice and pointing devices for tablets. You can get touchscreens on PCs. So every combination of input and screen size is out there. So one key takeaway, I guess, from all of this is you have to accept that it's okay for web pages or web apps to render and potentially even behave differently on different devices. In fact, it was always meant to be that way, right? The web was created by Tim Berners-Lee in CERN as a way of scientists in different departments on different computing environments to share information with one another. And I think that spirit is still there. So when you accept that, when you accept the way of the web, you start to see these you don't see fragmentation, you see diversity, you see this as a strength, right? You have the power to put something out there that anyone now and in the future can use anywhere. That's incredibly powerful. And so then you kind of become like Neo in the Matrix, right? No matter what requirements or frameworks or whatever come your way, you can just deal with it, no problem. So it's all well and good me telling you about all this lovely stuff, but you want to know in practice, right? How do we do this when we have to actually build a thing, right? How do we do this? How do we make these device agnostic experiences? And there's an old tried and tested technique, which I still think is kind of, well, I say technique, it's really more of a mindset, but I think it's the kind of the number one thing in our arsenal for tackling this. And that is progressive enhancement. It's magic. So for those that don't know, here's a little definition of progressive enhancement. It's from the book Resilient Web Design, which is by Jeremy Keith. That's a free online web book, by the way, so definitely check it out if you haven't seen it already. It's really good. And he has a kind of a 3-point definition for progressive enhancement that I quite like. So step 1 is identify the core functionality of your product. Step 2 is make that functionality available using the simplest possible technology. And then enhance. And you can enhance as many times as you like, and that hence the name progressive enhancement. So let's look at those in more detail. Identify the core functionality. I think this is perhaps one of the hardest things to do, but it's so important to do. If, hopefully, in your teams, if you are making digital products, you'll be doing some kind of UX work. It might be you, it might be your colleagues. And UX people will tell you a big part of that is research, right? Understanding your users, understanding the problem, figuring out the right solutions for them. So it's really, you really need to be clear about what problem you're solving and for whom. And once you've got that clear in your head, then you can think about what's the simplest way I can solve that problem. I think techniques like mobile first are very helpful. So that's from the book written by Luke Grabowski back in 2011. And he was essentially advocating, let's, this is still the case sometimes, but at the time, mobile was still relatively new. So people were used to a world where they were thinking of their products in terms of how they would appear on a desktop machine. And mobile stuff was an afterthought. And he was trying to turn it on its head because the argument is, if you start with a smaller, more constrained environment, essentially, right? Because you have less space and potentially less capabilities. Well, less in some ways, more in others, but then that forces you to prioritize. You have to think long and hard about, well, what is the first thing that's going to be on the top of my page or the top of my screen? How do I break down my functionality in a way that's going to work across all these devices? So that's a really good mindset to adopt. Arguably an extension of that people, as perhaps more prevalent today is content first, because if you take a step back from even the screen, it's really the content, right? Or the functionality, if you will. Like if I've got a sort of a linear stream of stuff, something has to be at the top. There can only be one thing. I think another sort of strand is inclusive design. So this is the idea that you're trying to, you want your products to be as inclusive as possible. You don't want to artificially limit people because of disabilities or situational problems or whatever it might be from using your products. And the way you go about that is you try and think about what those edge cases are and anticipate those and sort of design for them. So if you adopt some combination of these, I think that puts you in a good place to figure out what is the core of your product. And I'd argue what they've all got in common is prioritization. And it's such a simple thing to say, but it's actually really hard to do, right? If you look at a lot of websites, they have lots of things at the top, or they have carousels. And that's really just a symptom of people not being able to decide. If you have to have one thing at the top, there should only be one thing, right? So you kind of, it's a tough one to get there, but it pays off if you can do it. So once you've got that clear, step 2 is make that available using the simplest possible technology. So when we build things for the web, we always have this holy webby trinity of CSS, HTML, and JavaScript, right? Those are the raw ingredients. Now, we might not necessarily be writing our code in those. We might be using TypeScript or Sass or whatever. But ultimately, that's what gets sent down the wire, right? That's what the browser understands. And there's a relationship between all of these, right? They all create or manipulate the DOM, and that's ultimately the browser's representation of the stuff, and that's what drives the UI. So HTML obviously provides the kind of, if you will, the initial snapshot of what that DOM should be like, because it is the first thing the browser will receive. And then if you have JavaScript, you can read and write the DOM and manipulate it over time. And in this model, I would say CSS, it doesn't really affect the DOM itself, but it kind of reads from it in the sense that it's, selecting things and applying styles. So we kind of need all of these. And if we look at their sort of expressive power, it's fair to say I think that JavaScript has the most power in that sense, right? You can do pretty much anything in JavaScript. CSS is probably somewhere in the middle. I mean, you can do some pretty nifty layouts and describe some complex UI behaviors using just a few lines of CSS. And then HTML is comparatively simple, right? It's just the structure and the semantics of your UI or your content, and that's about it. But if we look at these from the perspective of resilience, it's kind of the other way around. HTML is actually very, very robust. So not only is it the first thing that arrives in your browser, but its parsing behavior is such that if any browser, or anything that's parsing HTML for that matter, encounters an element it doesn't understand, it doesn't error, it doesn't stop, it just ignores it and carries on. Same thing with attributes it doesn't understand. So we'll see in a moment how we can exploit that, but it means that if there are bugs in your code or something an old browser doesn't understand, it's not fatal, it just keeps going. CSS is similar. CSS, if there are properties or values that a browser doesn't understand, it just skips them and carries on. JavaScript, of course, because it is a procedural language, you have to, first of all, download the whole thing before you can execute any of it. And then when you do execute it, as soon as there is a syntax error or runtime error, it'll error out, right? The execution grinds to a halt, essentially. So looking at it from that lens, it's kind of the most brittle. You have to put the most effort into making it reliable and making it fail-safe. So if we're trying to build something using the simplest technology, oftentimes that will be the markup. Not always, but a lot of the time. And then you can consider your JavaScript and even your CSS enhancements on top of that. Because if you can deliver at least a baseline experience using HTML, then I would suggest that's a good thing to do. So then the third and final step of progressive enhancement is enhancing, right? CSI style, enhance, enhance, enhance. So let's look at each of those three languages in turn and see how we can use their features to do that. So as I mentioned, HTML browsers will ignore stuff they don't understand. So this is, I've traveled to the future, I've brought back HTML7. There is now a meme attribute, which lets you mark up what memes you're referring to. And there's a new subliminal element, which will feed stuff straight into the user's brain implants. The beauty, of course, is I can paste that into a browser today and it'll work. My browser won't crash. Of course, it's not going to do anything clever with the subliminal element, but it'll still render the text that's inside there, so that content will remain accessible to the user. And that's quite powerful because it means when real new features appear in the language, we don't have to wait. We can just start using them. As long as they are enhancements, as long as they're not critical for the core experience, we can start giving our users new bells and whistles, new enhancements straight away. It doesn't matter if there's only like 1% of the market that has that today, because, well, then 1% of users are a little bit more happy than the rest. And over time, that number will grow, right? Same thing with CSS. So maybe the next version of CSS has got a turbocharge option, which, I don't know, does something cool. So I'm going to crank it up to the max. But again, this will work, right? The color and the margin will still get applied, and any browser that doesn't understand that just carries on. And this is why, in particular, CSS can evolve at the rate it's evolving, right? When they brought out Grid, for example, a few years ago, we didn't have to wait for every browser to start using that. We could start peppering that into our code and using it. And JavaScript kind of has this feature detection pattern, right? So if we just blindly use an API, it's risky, because if it's not there, it might get a runtime error, things will blow up. But we can just check for the presence of a function or an object and write these simple little guards. So most of, you might not be doing this, you might be using some feature detection library, but under the bonnet, it's going to be doing some variation of this, right? And so this simple little if statement lets us, again, utilize new or upcoming features while still having a kind of a safe fallback. Now, of course, there are some things that can only be done in JavaScript. If you want to do some Ajax-y stuff, you got to use JavaScript. You can't use CSS, you can't use HTML. If you want to do anything interesting with Canvas, same story. And there's a whole host of other new features and new things popping up all the time, which are only possible in JavaScript. So if these are critical for your experience, right? If you're trying to do a 3D shooter in the browser, of course you're going to have to use JavaScript, because there is no other way of doing it. And that's fair enough, because if that's the simplest technology to deliver your experience, then go for it. But I would argue that a lot of the time, there are simpler alternatives, right? If you are, if you are Instagram, well, you can use HTML to have an image and a bit of text below it, and maybe even have an upload button. It's going to be clunky. It's not going to be as slick as the kind of enhanced experience that we want most people to get, but it'll still work. If you're doing a news site, it's just text, right? I mean, HTML will do. So I think there's a lot of stuff where we sometimes fall into the trap of over-engineering and over-depending on maybe CSS, maybe JavaScript, or things like that, to the point where if for some reason they fail, or they don't quite work the way we wanted them to, our users are left with nothing. And I suggest it's always better to give them something than nothing. So just because we can do something doesn't necessarily mean that we should. Great power comes great responsibility, all of that. But there's also, if you look at this at a more granular level, I think what often gets overlooked is there's a lot of functionality that browsers do for us for free. And we kind of ignore that at our own peril. So this is a classic one that I'm sure some of you will have come across, right? Styling a select element. Has anyone here had to do this before? Like, make one of these look like one of those? Yeah, I see a few hands. So the select element, which usually gives you a drop-down like that on the right, has been in HTML for yonks and is supported in every browser everywhere, but it looks a bit dull, and famously it's a pig to style up using CSS, although it has gotten a little bit better recently. And oftentimes, if you're a developer, you might be given designs that look more like the right-hand side and say, hey, build this. And you can't. So you have to sort of essentially rebuild your own select from scratch. So I've just grabbed an example there from Material UI. And that's fine, clearly you can, but there's actually a lot of work that goes into doing that. So just kind of peeking under the hood a little bit, this is the DOM for one and the other. And the HTML case, it's, there's actually the select element with its options, there's a label. I've associated the label with the select using the for attribute. So if I click on the label, it'll focus this. That's good for accessibility and usability. I've also used an ARIA attribute to associate the help text with it, so that kind of knows what goes with what. But essentially that will produce the result, and that will work not only in every browser today, but every browser in the future. So the drop-down you saw there, that's the rendering that you typically get on a desktop, right? When iOS and Android first arrived on the scene, they actually render that slightly differently. I think they still do. So rather than give you that drop-down on the page, they bring up an overlay, right? Like iOS has got the sort of Tumblr thing, and Android's got like a dialogue with the options in it. And they've done that because they've said, well, really, you're asking me to present the user with a bunch of options and the ability to pick one of them. And I, as the browser, will present that in the way that I feel most appropriate for the device and the scenario. So we're kind of leaning on the browser to do all the heavy lifting for us. If we start building our own, it's all on us. We have to do everything ourselves. And you can see that they've had to add lots of styles, they've had to add more ARIA attributes, they've got an SVG for the little chevron thing. There's actually two separate blocks because this is the overlay for the menu. So there's a lot more stuff going on. And I'm not saying one is right or one is wrong, right? Sometimes if you've got a really good reason to have a fancy drop-down, or you want to add some functionality that just cannot be done natively, then fair enough. But there is a cost with all of this, right? It's more code to maintain, it's more code to write, it's more complexity, it's more runtime overhead, it's going to use more battery, more CPU. And it's, it takes longer to download. And those things have an effect on the user experience as well. So there's a balance between these things, right? Sometimes to do that pretty picture, there's actually a lot more work that has to go in to make it happen versus something that is arguably less attractive, but better in other ways. So all these things exist in a balance. And I think that's an important thing because I see a lot of projects where people think of UIs purely in visual terms, especially if you've got sort of segregated designers and developers. So I'm guessing most of you are probably leaning more towards the development side, but if you've done UI work, you may have been in that scenario where those designs get thrown over the wall, you get like a PDF or a Zeppelin link or something, and then it's like, right, here's the thing, it's been signed off, just build it. If you're not, then you're very lucky, but that's certainly a scenario I see a lot. And often there's, it's hard because the people who've done that might not have been aware of the knock-on effect or the cost of some of their design choices. So ideally, you should be in a situation where you can collaborate together and have those discussions and sort of point out, well, I could build this, but it's going to be harder to make it accessible. It's going to be harder to make it reliable, work on different kinds of devices. And then you can make a more informed decision. Maybe you still do it, maybe you don't. The important thing is you have that discussion. And so I think progressive enhancement is not just a tech thing. It's not just for developers to do. It's for the entire team to do, right? Because it affects how you design the product. It affects the choices that you make for your UI. So everyone needs to kind of understand it and embrace it and work with it. And I think perhaps the strongest argument for working in that way is, at the end of the day, only one deliverable matters. I've stolen this title, by the way, from a really good blog post by Josh Clark. So if anyone wants the link, I can share it later. But they're kind of saying that our users ultimately use the software, right? They're using something that's running on a device, and that's what they interact with. They never see the sketch files the designers made. They never see the Jira tickets. They never see the project Gantt charts or any of that stuff, right? That's all just stepping stones to get us to the final product. So it's the final product that has to be right. And if we're spending time, let's say, iterating or perfecting or tweaking some of those ultimately throwaway assets at the expense of spending that time on the product itself, then I think that's a poor choice, right? So the more we can focus on getting the software right, the sooner we can work in the code, the more collaboratively we can work on that, the better. So that's, I would say, a really important mindset. And I think it's on all of us to push for that. So even if you are cast in the role of developer, you might not think of yourself as a designer, you might not think you're allowed or entitled to challenge designs, but I'm here to tell you you are, right? By the power invested in me in the ivory tower of the design council, you are all designers now. But seriously, like, don't be afraid to challenge these things, to push back, encourage that debate, because it's not that people are malicious and they're deliberately trying to make difficult designs, it's just they might not be aware of some of these nuances, right? Some of these details. And so if you do all of that, then, you know, you can, well, returning back to Venus, you can sort of, rather than worry about the fact that you're being crushed and burnt and melted and, you know, all the stress that you had to undergo to get there, you can instead marvel at the fact that you've effectively landed on another planet and you're doing wonderful things, right? Like, what we do is like landing space probes on other planets. So, well done all of you. I think that's really cool. And that's pretty much all I was going to say. Thank you very much for your time.